everyone, welcome back to Supply Chain 360. I'm Ralph Leindecker. In the last episode, we talked about Venezuela and the Bani world. What a US operation, sanctions, and an already fragile health system mean for access to medicines. Today, I want to zoom out. Because if you only ever look at Venezuela, or the Red Sea, or Taiwan, or Germany's energy debate one by one, you slowly lose the plot. That's not how executives actually experience risk. In reality, you're sitting on a portfolio of exposures. Some are on fire, some are quietly smoldering in the background, and some look stable until they suddenly aren't. So this episode is about moving from one country crisis at a time to what does my geopolitical risk portfolio actually look like as a pharma or medtech leader. I don't want to give you another framework slide. I want to talk through how you might think about this on a Tuesday afternoon with a pen and a blank sheet of paper. Let me start with a simple picture. Imagine you draw two axes. On the horizontal axis you put, how exposed are we to this region? That's not a theoretical number, it's very concrete things: revenue, volume, API dependence, CMOs, critical packaging, key trade lanes. On the vertical axis, you put how geopolitically fragile is this region right now. That is a mix of things like active conflict, sanctions, regime stability, infrastructure vulnerability, and how quickly the rules seems to be changing. You don't need the perfect data set to start. You can begin with judgment. The goal of this picture is not academic precision. It's to stop treating all countries and routes as if they were the same. Now you take a few of the places we've been talking about and drop them onto that sketch. Venezuela will end up somewhere in the upper left for most pharma companies. High fragility, but relatively low direct exposure. Taiwan might sit further to the right, because your direct sales may be small, but your indirect exposure through semiconductors, equipment, or contract manufacturers is much higher than it looks at the first glance. Red Sea and Suez are not even countries. They are corridors. They sit in a different category. When that choke point closes, your Asia-Europe flows change shape overnight, regardless of where your company is headquartered. And then you've got places like Germany, politically stable, but dealing with slow burn issues like energy prices and deindustrialization that affect where future manufacturing and R&D will sit. Just doing that rough mapping already changes the conversation. Instead of "we are worried about Venezuela," it becomes "we seem to have half our high margin portfolio dependent on a handful of fragile corridors in 2 or 3 politically exposed manufacturing countries." That's when it gets interesting. Now, if you listen to a lot of risk talk, it tends to stop at that picture. High, medium, low, red, amber, green, but that doesn't tell you what to do differently tomorrow. From a leadership point of view, the key question is, which levers can you actually set? You can't set the level of political stability in Venezuela. You can't set whether a Yemeni group decides to target container ships in the Red Sea next month. You can't set whether Beijing and Taipei escalate or de-escalate military exercises. Those are external conditions. You observe them, you react to them, but they are not management levers. The levers sit inside your own network and governance. For example, in a Venezuela-type situation, 3 very tangible choices matter a lot more than how loudly you say geopolitics is important on a slide. One is where you physically hold buffer stock and in which form. Are your critical products for the region sitting deep inside the country in a local warehouse or in a more stable neighboring hub with rapid deployment capability? The stock levels can be infinite. Budgets are real. But the location and form of that stock is something you can actually decide. A second lever is how your contracts handle sanctions and export control drift. Do you have clear clauses that allow you to reroute, pause, or terminate under changing legal conditions without ending up in a fight with your partners? Or are you depending on good relationships and hope? You cannot write sanctions risk out of existence, but you can design how the pain is shared and what room for maneuver you have. The third lever is decision rights. In some companies, anything that smells like sanctions automatically gets escalated to a global committee that meets once a month. In a fast-moving environment, that is essentially a decision to be laid to every change. In other setups, regional leaders have clear authority within a defined risk envelope and can move buffers, reroute, or pause shipments quickly as long as they lock the rationale. Those are three very mundane sounding things: inventory location, contract structure, decision rights. But each of them is something you can set on purpose, and each of them changes how vulnerable you are to exactly the same external event. The same logic applies to a corridor risk like the Red Sea. You can't decide whether ceasefire talks in the Middle East hold. You can decide whether your default Asia-Europe lane always depends on that choke point, or whether you keep a second lane contracted and exercised even if it looks inefficient on paper in quiet years. When you think in terms of a portfolio, you start to see patterns. Maybe you realize that the 3 of your top 10 SKUs rely on a single route or a single country that sits in the fragile but convenient quadrant. Maybe you notice that new launches are automatically being routed through the same hub you used 10 years ago, simply because no one ever went back to the map. That is where the executive judgment comes in, not in predicting exactly when a conflict will start, but in asking, do we really want this concentration of exposure given the world we're in? Let me ground this with a concrete decision situation. Imagine you're on a regional leadership team for a pharma company with significant sales across Latin America. You've got manufacturing in Europe and North America, API sourcing in Asia, and a mix of distributors and your own affiliates in the region. On Monday morning, you get an internal alert. New sanction designations related to Venezuela, some rhetoric about Colombia, markets moving slightly, and a spike in questions from local partners. The easy reaction is either panic or denial. Either you overcorrect and freeze everything, or you tell everyone to calm down until things are clearer. A portfolio mindset pushes you to a different sequence. First you ask, where exactly are we exposed? Not in theory, but in terms of shipments on the water, inventory on hand, open orders, and upcoming tenders. You have people pull a quick cut. Which products, which lanes, which counterparties touch Venezuela directly, and which ones sit in neighboring countries that might see knock-on effects, such as migration or funding shifts. Then you look at the levers inside that subset. For the products that are humanitarian critical, you consider shifting them where possible into established multilateral channels, like PAHO, UNICEF, or large NGOs that have more experience navigating the banking and licensing mess. That doesn't solve everything, but it often turns a completely blocked situation into a constrained but workable one. For the purely commercial flows, you might temporarily lower order frequency and raise minimum stock in neighboring countries like Colombia or Brazil to create a small buffer against volatility without announcing a dramatic shift. And in the background, someone reviews the contract and sanctions clauses with your main logistics providers and banks to understand how jumpy they are likely to be. That's not theory, that's phone calls. The point here is not that there is one correct response. The point is that you are acting on levers you control rather than sitting and watching the political news. Now, if we go back to that risk portfolio sketch, you can start to categorize not just regions, but types of risk. There are active intervention and sanctions cases like Venezuela. There are choke point and corridor cases like the Red Sea and Suez, where the geography itself is a vulnerability. There are low probability, high impact cases like a Taiwan escalation, which primarily threaten your technology and infrastructure backbone. And there are slow, policy-driven shifts in supposedly safe countries, like the debate around industrial electricity prices and long-term competitiveness in Germany. Each of these buckets interacts differently with your network, but what they all have in common is this: the executive levers live in your own design choices. Where are the plants and QC labs located? How are second sources qualified? How much of your API volume is dependent on a single political relationship? How much of your global launch plan depends on one corridor that's cheap today but fragile over a 10-year horizon? Those are not analytical questions only, they are governance questions. Who gets to decide that we accept a certain concentration? Who signs off on a second source that looks expensive in year 1 but buys resilience in year 5? Who has the authority to deviate from the optimized network design when signals from the world clearly change? In practice, what I see in many organizations is a split. Officially, geo-risk is everyone's job because it's on a slide in the enterprise risk register. In reality, it becomes nobody's job until something breaks. Then you end up with ex post rationalizations. Of course, we always knew this was risky, or nobody could have seen this coming. A more honest approach is to name geo-risk as a domain where executive judgment is needed ex ante, under uncertainty, with incomplete information, and then to give that judgment an institutional home, a network design council, a geo-risk board, a cross-functional group that actually reviews the portfolio of exposures a few times a year and recommends concrete design changes. Again, the lever is not awareness of geopolitics. The lever is, where do we embed responsibility for making and revisiting these trade-offs? There's one last thing I want to touch on because it often gets lost when we talk about geopolitics in abstract terms: accountability. In regulated industries like pharma, leaders are held personally accountable for patient safety and compliance. At the same time, they operate inside a web of constraints: price, pressures, tender rules, procurement cycles, shareholder expectations, and now increasingly volatile global politics. When you move from a country crisis mindset to a portfolio mindset, you're implicitly making a judgment about which risks you are willing to own and which ones you are not. If you decide to stay heavily invested in a fragile corridor because the economics are compelling, that is a legitimate choice, but it is a choice. If you diversify and carry higher costs in the short term, that is also a choice. What I would argue is that in a Barney world, the worst position is to pretend these are purely technical optimizations. They are not. They are value judgments under uncertainty. What your board and your regulators will expect when something does go wrong is not perfection. They will expect that someone can show a chain of reasoning. Here's how we saw the risk portfolio at the time. Here are the levers we adjusted. Here is why we accepted this residual exposure. And here is how we intend to adjust now that reality has moved. That is the difference between ex ante judgment and ex post storytelling. So to wrap this up, if you are a leader in pharma or healthcare supply chains, I would invite you to do 3 very simple things after this episode. First, draw that 2-axis picture for your own world. Exposure on one axis, geopolitical fragility on the other. Place a few regions and corridors honestly, not how you wish they were. Second, ask yourself for each of the red or amber spots, which levers do we actually control? Not in theory, but in terms of inventory, contracts, routes, decision rights, and governance. If you can't name a lever, you've probably just discovered a blind spot. And third, consider whether your organization has a clear place where these judgments are made deliberately and revisited, or whether they only surface in crisis meetings when it's already too late. We're not going to make the world less volatile, but we can make our decision logic more explicit, more honest, and more actionable, and in a Barney world, that is already a big step. Thanks for listening. If this gave you a different way to look at your own risk portfolio, feel free to share it with someone in your network who's wrestling with the same questions. I'm Ralph Leindecker, and this was Supply Chain 360. Talk to you in the next episode.